To start, tell us a little about what readers can expect from The Big Drift.
Well, this novel is really the story of two men's search for redemption on the cattle range of Texas in the 1880s. One man is white, one's black, and they're both in very dark places in their lives. They're both haunted by racially charged episodes in the past that can't be changed. And it takes a horse wreck and a blizzard to bring these two men together. But sometimes the storm inside a person is a lot worse than any blizzard can be. There's also a young woman and romance and adventure in the Devil's River country of Texas. And the Devil's River will certainly earn its name by the time the story is over with.
Yeah. Great. How did you become interested in this particular region of Texas?
Well, I have been writing and researching about West Texas, the Pecos River country, the Devil's River country, for more than 30 years. I was a reporter for the Midland, Texas Reporter-Telegram, and as a regional reporter, I would be sent out into the area to find feature stories, and I began hearing all these great tales and stories of lore and legend. And one thing led to another, and I began doing a series of articles about the legends of West Texas and the history, and so my interest just really kind of grew out of all of that.
Okay. Do you have favorite writers who have carved out a particular territory as you have?
Well, certainly I think any writer who writes about West Texas in terms of Western literature would do well to emulate Elmer Kelton. A wonderful man and a wonderful writer, and he certainly carved out a niche for himself in terms of West Texas history. And so really on the way home from his funeral services in 2009, I asked myself, who can carry on writing about West Texas? And by that time I had a number of nonfiction books about the area. So I thought it'd be a great way to honor his memory to turn to fiction based on my research into the area.
Do you have any tips for researchers or writers who want to delve into the history of a particular time or place?
Well, you can spend all the time you want to in archives, and which I do, and old newspapers and talking to the old timers. But until you go out and actually walk the landmarks, you don't really know the country. You don't really know what the pioneers experienced. Every understanding of history, I think, is dependent on a person's understanding of the geography. And by going to the landmarks, walking the old trails like I did on the Devil's River, I spent a lot of time down there, Camp Hudson and Beaver Lake, all of these historic spots. By walking the same landmarks, it gives me a common frame of reference for the people of the 19th century that I'm writing about. So I would recommend that anyone who wants to write about earlier times and earlier places to go there yourself and get a feel for the land.
While you were researching your setting for this novel, did you find any unexpected or particularly interesting information about the setting or the people?
Well, because it deals with the race relations in the Old West and on the Texas Range in the 1880s, I came across 7 interviews the Work Projects Administration funded between 1936 and 1940. And these 7 interviews were conducted with cowboys who had once been slaves or who were first-generation free men. And by studying their accounts, and some were taken down in dialect, and that gave me insight into the dialogue of my black character. And some incidents were actually based on things that occurred to some of these early black cowhands. Really, it's a remarkable set of interviews in the Library of Congress.
Okay, great. One big aspect of the Big Drift is the changes in weather. Can you give us some historical background on that winter of 1884 to 85?
Well, the Big Drift, now there were cattle drifts every year because in those days, open range country, there were no general fences and pastures, but every so many miles, every 100 miles or so, or 50 miles or so, they would stretch fences just to keep the cattle from drifting too far with winter storms. This would allow the roundups in the spring to be a lot easier because in terms of the Big Drift of 1884, cattle drifted as far as 600 miles from northern, from areas of the Great Plains, and this came down in a mass a mile wide at times, and trampled out a great path through. By the time we got to Texas, Odessa area, for example, it was an 18-inch snow, which is a lot of snow for that country. But when they would hit these drift fences at that time, they would stand there and die because their nature is to retreat from a storm. And the succeeding cattle then would actually bridge the fence by climbing over the carcasses and jumping off. So it really was a remarkable incident, the Big Drift, which brought on the big roundup of 1885, the largest roundup really in Western annals, when there were as many as 300 cowboys and 1,000 horses in the remuda to bring back these cattle who had ended up on the Devil's River, the Frio River, and the Pecos River, and then began to die. It was a carrion-ridden mess there for months.
Do you think more cattle would have lived without the drift fences in place?
Well, the drift fences were both pluses and minuses. The very fact that cattle could not retreat with the storm, could not march away from the storm unless the fences were breached, meant that someone would actually stand there and freeze to death standing up. Icicles would form over their nostrils and mouth. They could no longer breathe, and cowboys would actually come along and find cattle standing up, frozen solid and dead. And so probably more cattle would have survived, but in terms of the problems thereafter, regaining the cattle, returning them to 600 miles to their home range would have been very, very problematic.
Were there any significant changes in ranching practices following the Big Drift in response to what happened with drift fences or anything like that?
It was another good 12 years, about 1896, before the country, the Pecos country and the Devil's country, began being fenced.
Okay.
Fences only came in once windmills were introduced because you had to have a water source. And so the Big Drift in and of itself did not bring about any great change. Okay. And in fact, drifts continued each year until the pastures were all fenced in, just not on that extreme level.
Okay. For those who don't know, you have a unique method of riding while you hike. Would you describe that method? Talk about
I may
your
be the only
experiences.
person that does it, the only rider who does this. I walk 4.5 miles every day, and I literally take my paper and I walk along and I write. The Big Drift here, I put in 1,850 miles in it over the course of 395 straight days of walking and riding. I developed a new metric for riders, that is WPM, words per mile. I average about 35 words per mile. People will say, well, how much you like finishing that book? And I'll say, oh, about 800 miles. but sometimes it does bring about some interesting occurrences. I've stumbled a number of times, but never yet fallen. Two things I have to guard against, or one thing I have to guard against, is when I'm crossing a busy street, is to drag myself out of the 1880s where there are no cars and realize I'm crossing a street here. And but also I get so immersed in my work when I'm walking along. I was backpacking solo in Colorado during the riding of the Big Drift, and I thought I knew the trail, and so I'm walking along in one wilderness, riding and immersed in a wilderness 500 miles away and 120 years earlier, and I came upon a stream crossing I'd never seen before, and I realized I had stumbled off the trail and was, in essence, if not lost, then unsure of my position. And it took me 45 minutes to find my way back.
Wow.
So that is one of the things, I guess, to be on guard against.
Yeah, sure. How did you get started with that method? Did that just sort of develop with the love of outdoors, or?
Well, it actually began, as I mentioned, coming back from Elmer Kelton's services in 2009. At that time, I was doing a massive research project, a nonfiction research project that took up all my time in the daytime. But every evening, as I said, I would make my walks, and so I realized I have an hour and 20 minutes every single day in which I'm not doing anything except walking. And so I grabbed a paper and pen and began writing. And I quickly realized that I think much better when I'm on the go, when I'm walking, moving. I guess the blood circulates or whatever. But that's more or less how it developed.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you.